Vikings, it's First Chapter Friday, and today we're going to read A Season of Daring Greatly. This is by, I can't read it, there's a sticker over it. I hate when that happens. Ellen White. I'm so sorry. A Season of Daring Greatly. I found this in the sports section one day this week, and I thought, oh, that would be a great First Chapter Friday. So this is a sports fiction book. I think you guys are going to enjoy it. Here we go. She was going to annihilate him, paralyze him, petrify him, or maybe, okay, just make him nervous. All she really wanted was for him to swing and miss. She didn't necessarily have to turn him into a permanent emotional cripple, probably. And she bloody well didn't want to throw the curve. Why waste the good hook if she didn't need it? A little heat in the guy's eyes, and he'd be so sure he would rip it that she'd be able to enjoy a pleasant breeze, which would be refreshing on a warm spring afternoon. Now Leonardo wanted her to waste one load and outside, but he was only a sophomore and he liked the instinct of dad, so she shook him off and knew he was going to ask for the curve again, which he did. When she didn't respond at all, he finally took him long enough to put down the sign for the fastball. Okay, then. She touched the bill of her cap and then took a deep breath, and her enemy was so eager that she could almost feel how hard he was gripping the bat, ready to take her out of the yard. But frankly, the batter didn't interest her much. He was an impediment, a minor distraction, a vague annoyance. Right at eye level, deceptively tasty, he wouldn't be able to resist hacking it. She came to her set position, rotated the baseball a few times inside her glove. It felt lovely. And then her fingers automatically found the four-seam grip she could form from her sleep and sometimes did. Leg drive, release point, downhill. She wound up and felt her arm slot in just the right sweet spot as she let the ball fly. A good, hard, rising fastball. Her right leg coming down with a nice, smooth follow-through on the dirt. Her left leg landing a second later so that she was already poised to field a comebacker when he swung and missed violently. She saw the umpire's arm come up to signal the third strike, and although Leonardo had elevated anxiously out of his crouch to snag the ball, it landed in his glove with quite a satisfying smack. Oh yeah, she was bad. Game over. Her teammates were all congratulating her, though she couldn't really hear anything because her head was still buzzing, but they were happy, and there were a lot of high fives and claps on the back. Leonardo came out of the mound and stuck the ball in her glove as she nodded. You called a good game, she said. Thanks. He grinned sheepishly because they both knew she had called her own game, every step of the way. But no one would ever say that she wasn't a magnanimous in victory. That last one had some serious heat, he said. The herd was pretty loud about it. The herd, the flock, the clan, all otherwise known as the group of Major League Scouts, a number of whom showed up more often than not when she was scheduled to pitch, along with college coaches and a few agents usually. There was almost certainly a bunch of reporters, too, since there was always were. She'd heard cameras clicking constantly during the game, a much bigger crowd than usual today since it was her last high school start, and the draft was coming up. And, well, anyway, she had made a point of not looking in the stands because it was better not to know, although she had caught her mother reading a book at one point, sitting at the top of the metal bleachers directly behind home plate. They lined up to shake hands with the other team, and again, she couldn't really hear what anyone was saying, although she smiled and nodded and pretended to make sincere eye contact. Adrenaline was freaking noisy. But she couldn't help stiffening when she passed the guy who had bunted, some punk interfielder, for the one hit of the game. Sorry about that, he muttered. It was well placed, Jill said evenly. Although it had been a totally Bush League move on his part, if in fact well placed. The beefy first baseman she had struck out, he'd fanned 3 times actually, gave her a hand slap and scowled at her. You get asked on many dates? Of course not, Jill said. I'm tall. That made him smile a little, although one of the guys behind him mumbled a bad word, and a couple of the others laughed. She didn't even bother responding, since she heard some version of that every time she played, and it was both tedious and predictable. She shook hands and exchanged hellos with the other team's coaches, who were both polite, at least on the surface, and was very relieved um, when the fakeness was over and she could go into the dugout and take a couple of minutes to try and come down from the intensity of the last 7 innings. Her cooler was at the far end of the bench in the old wooden dugout, and she started unbuttoning her uniform shirt, which felt quite heavy and damp as she worked her way down the splintery steps. The ice packs she had brought were nice and cold, and she assembled her shoulder and elbow wrap and then strapped it over her compression shirt. Anything hurt? Her coach asked. She shook her head, adjusting the straps again, since of course they had been designed to fit a guy. You've had a live one today, he said, and she nodded. Good, loud pops in Leonard's gloves, and there had been more than a dozen pitches he couldn't handle at all, including several curves. A shutout, which would have been a no-hitter. 18 Ks or strikeouts. 2 errors, 3 pass balls on strikeouts, and a walk, except the ump had blown the ball 3 call, which had definitely been a strike. Well, all right, whatever. It didn't matter much. She always kept a couple of frozen washcloths in her cooler, too, and she pressed one to her face, taking a few deep breaths. Okay, decent game. Not her best, but solid. You back yet? Mr. Portman asked. She shook her head, focusing on the cold cloth. Well, let me know when you are, so I can tell you what a great game you just pitched, she said. Mr. Portman was a nice guy who was a history teacher who coached baseball rather than say the other way around, a very good history teacher as it happened. She nodded, and then sponged off her face with a cold cloth and draped her jersey over her shoulders, buttoning the top button so that it hung sort of like dashing red and white baseball cap, which is maybe a little theatrical, but a lot better than wandering around in front of the cameras in a very tight, sweaty compression shirt. Then she took another deep breath, let it out, and shook her head to try to release the last residue of the kill-them-all game fever. How many photographers? She asked. At least a dozen or more, Mr. Portman said. All right, then. Jill checked her hair, able to feel that the bun was still reasonably well in place. She'd never been a big fan of the perky ponytail stuck through the back of the cap look, and her friend Lauren had come up with what she described it as an if Audrey Hepburn were a serious jock look, which she had been using during games since 10th grade. They had no experiment. Jill didn't have any innate gifts whatsoever when it came to things like hair and makeup, but it had turned out that the low bun served the purpose of resting neatly below her hat, and more to the point, it kept her hair out of her eyes when she was trying to play. And an added benefit was that her grandmother no longer sighed as deeply when she appeared in her baseball uniform, but would take a small, brave breath and say, Well, you've brought about a touch of elegance to it, at least. Most of the team was packing up their gear bags and looking very cheerful since they had just won their 4th game in a row. Bobby, their under-talented but always hustling sophomore second baseman, put a bottle of Gatorade in her hand, and she drank half of it in about 4 seconds. Thanks, she said, and finished off the rest in a few gulps. That was a great double play in third. Bobby grinned and exchanged high fives with Antonio, their more talented but quite tiny shortstop. Her infielders had turned 2 double plays in seconds after the Putz who bunted had taken his lead. She'd picked him off. She'd also lost 3 outs on the dropped third strikes, too. But still, that bunt. She should have anticipated it, and she should have gone off the mound about twice as fast. Or maybe she just figured that the kid was going to do it in the first place. Before it happened, she could probably talk a couple of her teammates or maybe their assistant coach right into sticking around and hitting her bunts for a while. But it would either look like a false hustle or, tough as she was, it would make her look bad. The latter, possibly. Not too far from the truth. If you want to finish reading A Season of Daring Greatly and see what happens, come check it out. I will say that when I read the inside of the cover about our possibility of going pro and playing Major League Baseball, it was what made me want to read the book. And this is now definitely on my to-read list. And I don't normally read sports fiction, but I really think I want to read this one. So I hope you enjoyed our first chapter Friday, and I will see you guys again next week for another installment.